evening, welcome to the program. Tonight we're taking a very different look at the election campaign through the eyes of Australians abroad. There are around 1 million expats living around the world, about half of them in Europe, about a quarter in Asia. While they might be a long way from home, they can vote too. Now, we've heard a lot in this campaign about innovation, about entrepreneurship, about how Australia can compete on the world stage and make the most of global opportunities, particularly with our transitioning economy. Well, tonight we've brought together some of those who've been there and done that. 4 Australians with experience in succeeding internationally. What do they think of the election campaign here and whether Australia is heading in the right direction? Let me introduce them for you. David McCann joining us from New York. David is the Director of Strategy and Communications for ColourZen, which is a New York-based environmental startup. Paul O'Donnell is joining us from London. And Paul is a seasoned financial markets executive, a business owner, advisor and mentor to startups and established businesses. We have Tracy Colgan in Melbourne, actually, but Tracy is the president of the Beijing-based Kamsky Associates company, and she's the managing director there as well. Has a lot of experience in, well, financial services, automotive, natural resources, aviation, and on it goes. Elena Douglas is with us from Perth. And Elena was the founding CEO of Advance, an organisation that links Australian expats in different parts of the world. And she now teaches at the University of WA in social investment and philanthropy, and is also the CEO of the innovation consultancy firm Knowledge Society. A very good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world to you all, and thank you all very much for joining us. I just want to start with the general impression you have of the Australian election campaign that's underway. David McCann in New York, let me start with you. Are you following it closely? Are expats generally following it closely? And what's standing out to you as your biggest impressions of this election campaign here?
Yeah, I mean, I think Australians in New York especially, there's plenty of us over here and we're following it. I think mostly through social media. There's a lot of interesting stuff being posted by my friends back in Australia and other expats here. Certainly it's interesting to see the Australian election happening at the same time as the US election, and so lots of my friends here are asking questions about that contrast. You know, so you've got that sort of scary Trumpian circus over here, and at the same time you've got a relatively reasonable, interesting election campaign going on back in Australia. So yeah, there's a lot of interest, and I think people want to know more, so there's a real demand for additional services like this one, and more information coming, more information from the political parties and from others for folks who are living overseas.
Yeah, I don't think we've got anything quite as dramatic as Donald Trump in this campaign. Yes, we've still got a week to go, you'll never know. Paul O'Donnell, let me ask you, what has been, what's piqued your interest in this campaign? What's been your general take on it so far from where you are?
As David said, there's been a lot of social media around it, so what we're picking up here really is what's coming through that source. But I think it's it's interesting again because you can compare it to the US election a bit, but also in the UK we've got Brexit referendum today. So there's a lot of politics every time you turn on the TV or on the radio or whatever, or computer, it's to do with politics. So the Australian process or the Australian argumentation that's going on is very civilised compared to what's going on here and certainly what's going on in the US.
Yeah, Tracy Colgan, you're normally based in Beijing, but you happen to be in Melbourne at the moment. Let me ask you the same question. I mean, what's been your take on the election? Do you see it as an important election for Australia when you, I guess, consider more recent elections that have taken place?
Certainly in the context of the Australian business community in China, I think that we've been very lucky over the last couple of Prime Ministers to have had a lot of support. We've had regular visits over to the country. There's been an increasing engagement. So from that perspective, I don't think this is going to change. In terms of, my colleagues and friends in the community in China, we're all, of course, watching this very closely. But in terms of the Chinese media, we're seeing much more about the US election, Brexit, those sorts of issues. So we really have to be working through social networking and other channels to find out what's going on. But the issues, of course, affect us.
Yeah, well, Elena Douglas, I mean, just picking up on a point Tracy makes there, that whoever wins this election, is there going to be much change, do you think, in how Australia performs globally?
Well, I think that the narrative around innovation has been much stronger coming from the Malcolm Turnbull side, from the Liberal side. That's been a much stronger feature, growth, rather than perhaps on the Labor side, health and education being the stronger theme. So I think that the expat community were absolutely buoyed last December when the National Innovation and Science Agenda really was unleashed, because that million Australians abroad has so many brilliant scientists, entrepreneurs, Silicon Valley, Tel Aviv, Boston. There's professors galore, the community in London, the financial services communities in London and Singapore and Hong Kong and Boston and New York. These are the people who are sort of on the front line of global business and innovation. I mean, for instance, there's 20 professors, Australian professors at Harvard and MIT in Boston alone. So this community resonates very strongly with innovation and unleashing Australia's potential, because a lot of those people went abroad because they couldn't really fly their wings in Australia. So that's the message that I think resonates strongly.
Well, just on that, Elaine, let me ask you that, and this has long been the case, hasn't it, that Australians, particularly young Australians who are really succeeding in their chosen field, will ultimately go abroad. Now, when we look at the innovation space in particular that you're talking about, is the idea to try and keep more of those brains here in Australia, and do you think that what Malcolm Turnbull in particular is talking about is going to achieve that?
Well, it's a much better start, because we're at 25 million people, so you can't be Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is the world's destination for talent. So you can only, go so far. But the fact that we've had companies like Atlassian emerge out of Australia, I mean, Atlassian is a bigger company than Qantas, and it was founded by, young people, Scott I've forgotten the name of the other founder, Mike Cannon-Brookes, Scott Farquhar and Mike Cannon-Brookes, who are part of Advance. So they built that company as a global first company. So it proves we can do it. Seek is another one. There are other examples, but we've got a long way to go before we have a real pipeline of those sorts of companies that can be the new jobs for Australians.
Paul, let me come back to you there in London. I mean, is Australia seen as a country of innovators? Are we seen as an innovative economy, or are we seen, as many here I think suspect, as more of a quarry for iron ore, coal, natural gas and so on? How is Australia viewed, do you think, generally?
I think the Australian economy and the Australian people are viewed differently. The economy is, often is described more in the resources end of it, pretty obviously, over the last few years. But when you get to talk about the people, it's very different. It's very innovative. It's considered very innovative. Australians are making a tremendous difference in the UK and Europe with their education, but also they're straight shooters, they're great managers, and they really are. They're managing a lot of FTSE companies, and they're doing an incredibly credible job doing that. It's it's an issue with entrepreneurship in us improving a lot.
Yeah, well, both sides, let me come back to you, David McCann in New York, both sides of politics are talking about ways to encourage startups, ways to encourage entrepreneurs, incubators and different policy ideas. What do entrepreneurs, what do those who are, as you are there in New York, what do they need from an Australian government to actually take off?
Yeah, I mean, I think Australia's got a lot of sort of natural benefits to it, but there's a few things that are natural constraints as well. It's a small market. It's a relatively capital constrained market compared to, say, the US entrepreneurial startup market over here. So I think fundamentally what startups are looking for is capital. They're looking for highly educated, committed folks to work for them. And I think some of the education policies that are announced, they're the sort of guts of these innovation policies that, you know, you hear a lot about innovation and startup encouragement, but what you really need is a context, a capital context, so that you can actually start up with confidence and build your business with confidence. So it's not just the startup. It's not just going from 1 to 10. It's going from 1 to 100 or 1 to 1,000. And so you need a sufficient market, free trade agreements and so on help build that market. But you also need a pipeline of people, a pipeline of capital that can allow you to go from sort of small to big, but not have to relocate. As you mentioned earlier, there's this relocation phenomenon that we sometimes see, and I think the Australian political parties are right to think about Australia not just a resources economy, but also as a progressive economy, a good place to live. And those are some of the things that encourage startups to start up and to stay in Australia.
Yeah, well, surely we're seen as a good place to live. I mean, let's cut to the chase here. We've all got to agree on that. I mean, whether the economy is big enough for entrepreneurs and other companies to want to, you know, base themselves here, I guess, is another question. But yeah, it's a pretty good place. I don't know what you're all doing abroad. It's a lovely place. I don't know. It's a great place to live.
I think that's right, David. But I think there's a few things that do sort of, you know, tip the hand of Australian that sort of display some of Australia's constraints, and so especially here in the US, where you're thinking about gay rights and gay marriage and gun law reform. You know, these are some of the topical issues here. You know, Australia does lag behind on some of those issues. They're seen as anomalous sometimes amongst communities who are living overseas, and some of the things we need to work on back in Australia to maintain that sort of progressive, good place to live.
Well, that's an interesting point. Are you suggesting there that because we haven't yet, you know, adopted same-sex marriage is one example? I mean, what else feeds into that conception or perception that we're not progressive enough to attract as we want?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think it's no coincidence that Silicon Valley and New York are the hotbeds of entrepreneurial startups here in the US, and they're both progressive, diverse, tolerant places. I think that's you know, you go to a sort of the Twitter campus, you go to the Apple campus, and there's sort of wonderful, family-friendly, gay-friendly places to live and work. And so Australia needs to be conscious that it's not just having a nice beach, it's also having the sort of social and human rights infrastructure that allows people to live happily with their partner, relocate there confidently, and then get married if they want to, for example. So I think
does anyone else agree with that?
Things when you're trying to recruit people.
Does anyone else agree with David on that?
It was only 12 months ago that you couldn't do that in the United States. So Silicon Valley emerged and was an amazingly creative, vibrant place through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and these things took a long time to happen. So I think Australia's close to that stuff happening. I don't think that's what's prohibiting our entrepreneurial capacity. I think the more important things are the way Australians look at markets like China and the way Australians look at the opportunities presented by these free trade agreements that have been signed. I mean, for instance, we're not going to be Silicon Valley, but we have the largest fleet of robotic vehicles in the world in the Pilbara. So earlier we were talking about mining. We have to change this perspective about Australia as a quarry. They are the most advanced, the big data usage in the world. The leading users of big data in the world are energy companies, mining companies and astronomy. And medicine. So we're good in those areas. We have the largest science project in the world happening here with the Square Kilometre Array. So I think we actually need to be much more conscious of our strengths and how those big industries should be where our startups are looking to form ecosystems, not trying to compete in creating the next Twitter or the next Facebook. We should be looking to create more like the German model, more like the Mittelstand, the medium-sized global behemoths that the German economy produces based on long-term strengths, agriculture, mining. So I think we should have a different approach, and a lot of that has got to do with the way we see ourselves.
Oh, that's really interesting what you're talking about there. And yeah, sorry, go ahead, Paul.
No, I was just going to say, look, the Australian psyche, I guess, is fundamentally a bit conservative, but it's really changed a lot. Really changed a lot. In the time that I haven't been living in Australia, it's changed staggeringly. So it'll catch up, in its own time. I think the other point I was going to add to David's comment was what entrepreneurs need is mentors. Now, mentors here in the UK, the US, but also in Australia as well. That drawing on other people's experiences, learning from their mistakes, which is a proper way of doing it, to be honest, is tremendous. But I think Australia's got a great story to tell, and people just need to get out there and be confident enough to tell it.
Tracy, let me draw on your experience in China. A few have mentioned the free trade agreement now in place, but of course with each sector it'll roll in over time, bringing down various trade barriers. What do you think are the great opportunities that perhaps many aren't seeing at the moment when it comes to that free trade agreement with China, how we can make the most of it? In what areas do you see the biggest potential?
Well, first I'd just like to say that I think people have mentioned the fact that Australians perhaps aren't confident in their ability to move out into markets, and I think that looking at the China market, that's where that becomes the most obvious. The free trade agreement actually, I think, has been amazing, because what it's done is it's actually focused this country on China. I mean, when I first went to China in 1987, nobody was talking about China. People couldn't understand why I was going to the place. And now, of course, it's on everybody's lips. So the free trade agreement, just by focusing people on that market, is very, very important. It does cover, of course, all of the industries that you'd expect. So in terms of tariff reduction, we're all very up to speed with the potential for agriculture here, for tourism, for education, all those sorts of things. But very much so with those consumables, tapping into the growing Chinese middle class. But I really see especially areas where that free trade agreement really overlaps with China's 13th five-year plan, and that's about innovation. The 13th five-year, the newest five-year plan is completely about innovation, and you see that at every level of government you meet with, at every type of company or company structure that you meet with, where they're looking to see how they can go and leverage that. And I think that's where the overlap is. That's really interesting, because I always say that when you're digging up iron ore or with fruit from the trees, producers here have to be mindful about how they enter the market. It's not good enough just to hand the product over. They also need to think about how that product and how that brand is handled in country, because Australia has a remarkable brand in China. Brand Australia is really worth something.
And in countries a really interesting point, because many have said to me that while you can break down the trade barrier at the border of China, there's often a whole bunch of different hurdles within China's bureaucracy that Australian exporters will confront.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I'm also chair of AusCham Beijing, the Chamber of Commerce representing Australian business in Beijing, and we have a network around the country. And we certainly see that. We're seeing the non-tariff barriers are still there. Of course, TAFTA is an agreement that's going to be renegotiated over a period of time, and we'll certainly be putting our points of view as business representatives to the government, so when they have those discussions, they'll be taking this into account. But what I want to say is, with these sorts of things, I think really for businesses, their greatest resource are the Australian people who are in country and who understand the market. Yes. Advance does a fantastic job linking us all together. The AusChams around the country are absolute resources there for Australians who are coming in, because it's really about building up those people resources, and that's how, when you're not so confident, that's how you learn, by having that scaffolding.
Yeah, and it gets back to what Paul's saying about learning from others, learning from their mistakes as much as anything, and what they're doing in countries like China. Can we just come back to this question about what expats want to see in the Australian election campaign? What's going to swing their vote, I suppose? Paul, We've got Malcolm Turnbull offering a company tax cut. It's the centrepiece of his re-election strategy here. Bill Shorten focused very much on health and education and traditional Labor values, fairness, if you like. But for expats where you are, a lot of them in London, what do you think is going to swing their vote?
I think it's where the rubber hits the road. They're not so concerned about reductions in company tax in Australia. They're more interested in what programs there are going to be to help them do what they're doing better, but also to help them do what they're when they eventually want to go back. Because that's personal and it's important. So having those sorts of programs, obviously supporting an organisation like Advance is going a long way to do that. But there are other ways of doing it as well.
Elena, what do you think?
Look, my perception is that innovation agenda, the belief that Australia can sort of let off the shackles and have another era of growth and development. So that's my perception, that the community that I've stayed most in touch with want to see strong infrastructure funds for science and better infrastructure, cities and reducing congestion and making cities better, those sorts of things. I mean, we've got the diaspora are very urban and they move between different cities and they're very knowledgeable about how cities work and run. And I think there's been a sense, I mean, Sydney coming back into its own again, but there was a sense of a sadness after the Olympics that Sydney didn't have the mojo that it's getting now, and there was great joy at Melbourne sort of rising. So I think those are the sorts of things that global expatriates talk about, cities.
Yeah, and look, cities policy is another one of Malcolm Turnbull's favoured areas. About making a place more livable, having a 30-minute city, if you like, where you're not travelling for hours to get from home to work and so on. I suppose all of that matters to high achievers in whatever sector to attract them to come and live in a city. David McCann, let me come back to you in New York there. What about Australia's foreign policy approach? How important is that? How we behave, who we align ourselves to, very closely with the US, but increasingly closely economically with China as well. Is that taken into account by expats and others looking at Australia on the world stage?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think because we're overseas, we don't get the sort of comprehensive coverage that you receive when you're in Australia and you're able to watch Sky News, for example. But we do get snippets, and the snippets are often things that are either egregious or outrageous, exceptional, outrageous or courageous. So you get snippets of the things that either show, some political leadership, and I think something like, for example, Labor's negative gearing reforms have shown some real courage politically. But you also hear a lot about the things in foreign policy terms, to your point, David, that are sort of unusual or exceptional. And so we do get a lot of coverage of things like the handling of the refugee issues, around the sort of innovation agenda. The innovation agenda made a lot of news, but then there were some odd articles in, for example, the New York Times about the cutting of science and CSIRO funding for climate science, where Australia has been a real leader. So that was sort of these anomalous sort of snippets that we get over here, and I think it speaks to the sort of importance of foreign policy, because that sort of very directly affects folks living overseas.
Yeah, and look, Paul, as you've indicated, everyone's focused right now on Brexit over there with the vote underway as we speak. But it's something too that's been on the mind of a lot of Australians as well, and the prospects of Australia, if Britain were to leave, building a much closer trade relationship even with Britain if it's no longer part of the EU. I mean, how is Australia viewed right now, do you think, in the context of that debate in the UK?
But I think Australia is and has always been a country that punches way above its weight. And in the UK, that hasn't changed. None of that has changed, actually. And irrespective of the outcome, I can't understand why it would change. The outcome really is not just trade, it's also culture. And it's also, do the Brits really want to be part of Europe or not, culturally and socially? And that's a completely different question. But his relationship with, say, the US and Australia, that's a given in a sense. It still has to be worked out, obviously, but it's not being affected one way or the other.
Tracy, we've had for years, longer, various prime ministers talking about getting closer to Asia. Paul Keating, John Howard, Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard, Tony Abbott, now Malcolm Turnbull. And we've had our ups and downs with Indonesia. We've certainly grown a lot closer to China over the years. What do you think is the perception of Australia as a gateway to Asia? Are we seen as a good way for either European or Americans to find their feet in Asia, in China in particular?
Yes, I have heard people express that opinion, actually, where certainly from, for example, Israel, where there's a lot of collaboration in the innovation space, and Australia is seen as a way of entering China. It's something that I think that's actually, quite important to play that role. I think also we need to see ourselves as a gate. The Chinese, the way they view Australia, is perhaps a gateway to the rest of the world. We have a very positive relationship with China. I think that Australians are, by nature, we're practical and measured, and I think the Chinese respond well to that. So
is it being tested though, Tracy? Do you think
strong?
Will that be tested though, and is it being tested by issues around the South China Sea? I mean, how much does that actually impact on the ability to do business in China?
Those sorts of issues, of course, are quite sensitive, but I believe that at that level of government, obviously you're representing your nation's interests and you express an opinion, and it's taken in that way. I haven't found that when those issues have arisen that there's been an impact on Australian business. I still think that the Chinese leadership and the Chinese people see Australia as a good partner. And of course, with a lot of their investments into Australia, you can see those almost as testing the waters for further expansion into markets like the US, which I would argue would still have fairly high barriers for Chinese investment.
Let me ask you all just a final question, and it's about, I guess, the perception of political stability here in Australia, because John Howard was the last Prime Minister to actually serve a full term. We've churned through a lot since then, and Turnbull is obviously asking voters to back political stability this time and give him another go around. Are we seen as an unstable political climate? Elena, what do you think on this one?
I think sometimes when with big industries, big global industries, where capital can move between countries, so big industries like mining, I think there was a perception when resources, rent taxes and things like that came without proper consultation. I think that created a global capital moment. But I think in Australia we overestimate how much the rest of the world thinks about us. We are quite little in the end, and most of the rest of the world are just flat out dealing with their own countries and other global issues. So I don't think that the international... There's a few jokes about, the number of changes in Prime Minister, but I haven't noticed that that's made as much impact as something like the proposed mining tax.
Yeah, all right. Well, but Paul, surely Britons must ask you at times, what's going on? Why do you keep changing Prime Ministers in Australia?
Yeah, they do, but they've also got Italy on its doorstep, and that happens every 6 months. So it's not. It's what Elena said. I agree with 100%. It's much more to do with regulatory changes, which may be onerous or not thought through properly, and much less to do with prime ministers and settling and so on. Because people still see Australia as a very stable democracy, and that's what counts.
Yeah, well, let me ask you, David, there in New York, is that your sense as well? Despite the chopping and changing of the Prime Minister's job, we're still seen as a stable place?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is remarkable how the Australian democracy sort of continues to deliver a really serious amount of stability. There's a political centre in Australia which is occupied by both parties, and so I think you've got the sort of the left and the right leaning folks, but you don't have, for example, when Americans are comparing their own country to Australia, you don't have this sort of divergent political spectrum where people are forced to the edges of the reasonable. You've got a policy framework which is supported by good public service, good institutions. There are a lot of things that Australia's got right, and other countries like America looks to Australia to emulate. But sadly, the American political structure is not conducive to that. It sort of does pull people to either side because of campaign finance and gerrymandering of electorates and these sorts of things. So I think Australia needs to cement those political infrastructure. The parties need to do this too, where that allows them to occupy that sort of reasonable centre of Australian political life.
We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, because we are right out of time, but I think we've got a bit of agreement at the end there on it. Really interesting to hear your views on the Australian election and your ideas as to what Australia can and should be doing internationally as well to make the most of global opportunities. Really appreciate you all joining us from various parts of the world tonight, or as I say, this morning on the other side of the world. Thank you so much, and we'll look forward to talking again.
Thanks, David.
Soon. All right, we are going to take a break and then return to, well, the local view on the election with Paul Kelly and Peter Hartcher. Stay with us.